All life on Earth is based on a versatile chemical element, carbon. Depending on how its atoms bond to each other, it can be as hard as diamonds or as soft as graphite. When carbon bonds with oxygen, it becomes gaseous. Worldwide, it's these carbon dioxide emissions that we need to reduce. That's because the colorless and odorless gas is considered the main cause of global warming. And that is affecting weather patterns everywhere, from the polar forests in the north to the Amazon in the south. The many faces of carbon, coming up on Tomorrow Today, DW's Science Magazine.
Faces from the depths of human history. 2,000-year-old carvings that have emerged from the water for the first time in the modern world. For archaeologist Carlos da Silva, the one positive aspect of the terrible drought hitting the Amazon. These images reveal the culture of the early Amazonian peoples. The earth, the water and the forest were the basis for their survival. That's still true of many people here today, a fact that has become painfully clear. The largest drainage basin in the world is going through the worst drought since record-keeping began. The difference between rainy and dry seasons has never been so dramatic. 2 hours from Manaus, the capital of the state of Amazonas, the city council has sent these villagers help in the form of clean drinking water. There are no roads to the village of Jatorane, and now boats can only come so far as the waters have receded. Village elder Narciso Ferreira has to decide who gets which canisters. Then the villagers set off in 40-degree heat over hills that in the past just cleared the waterline. What was once a wide lake area has been reduced to a few rivulets. Each family has received 40 litres of water. We join Narciso and Domingos. Even with the small flat-bottomed boats everyone uses here, it's getting harder and harder to make progress. Inevitably, we get stuck. Time to try a different channel. We turn off the engine and move back a little. But at some point, there's no other choice. We have to get out to lighten the load. Domingos heads on alone, taking the heavy canisters to the house. He'll collect us later. The river is our street here. It's the carpet that connects us. Here in our region, the river is everything. Without it, we're nothing. Even in the dry season, the river normally laps right up to these steps. This drinking water is only enough for a few days, but when it's time to make another run, they may not be able to get out of here, even with the smallest of boats. It's hotter here today than it's ever been before. You can only bear it in the shade and with lots of cold water. That worries us. I'm worried about our lake. If the fish die out, we'll no longer be able to fish. The lake is essential for us. The fish are dying because the overwarm water can't absorb enough oxygen. And the region's well-known river dolphins aren't faring well either. More than 100 died in Lake Tefé. Researchers were initially puzzled because dolphins breathe air. But post-mortem dissections showed the high water temperatures, which topped 39 degrees, seemed to have caused the dolphins to suffer strokes. For climate researchers like Aaron Bezerra, it's more evidence of unpredictable consequences caused by disturbing the Amazon's complex ecosystem. High and low water phases are normal in the Amazon region. That's not the problem. What worries us climate researchers is that these phenomena are becoming more frequent and more extreme. The El Niño weather phenomenon, which occurs every few years, is currently exacerbating these effects. But the main cause is the destruction of the rainforest. El Niño is driving moisture from here to the southern Atlantic. On top of that, there's deforestation, which means there's less water evaporating from trees. The consequences are less rain and brutal heat, with temperatures reaching 44 degrees Celsius. If that continues, the consequences will be catastrophic. And that will impact the whole world, he says, because the Amazon rainforest's ability to store and vaporize vast amounts of water helps regulate the global climate. We talk about airborne rivers, masses of water that evaporate above the forest and then move north and south, thus keeping the global climate in balance. That's because water vapor buffers intense radiation, and deforestation means that less water evaporates. The dry season is starting earlier and earlier in the Amazon. So the water disappears faster, leaving ships stranded for weeks or even months on end. With a safe harbour in sight, tugboat captain Junior Caesar thought he'd be able to make it, but he was wrong. We tried to make it out, but help arrived late, and the water levels dropped really fast, by 30 centimetres a day. We were fighting the clock. Time was our enemy. Until the water returns, the captain will have to remain in his boat to deter potential thieves. A little further west, Valdemar's home would normally be floating in 10 metres of water. Now he's had to dig a well in the riverbed to get water to live. We use the water for washing up, washing clothes, showering. We add chlorine, then it's safe. What appears at first glance to be a picturesque valley is actually a tributary of the Amazon. The grass still bears witness to the masses of water that have seeped away and evaporated here. Valdemar is 74 years old and lives from fishing. Now he's stranded and worried. The more the rainforest is cut down, the more difficult it gets, because the drought is getting worse. For the time being, Valdemar's fishing nets are serving a different purpose. The bed of the tributary is now a soccer field, and they'll catch balls instead of fish until the water returns.
North of the Arctic Circle, the permafrost is thawing due to the unusually warm temperatures. This is causing carbon dioxide to escape from the ground. The hot weather is also driving wildfires. Huge areas of forest recently burned in Canada. Will the forest ever grow back?
Okay, so just be careful here, Vivian, because there's been a lot of smoldering and there's a lot of holes in the ground.
Jennifer Balzer leads us through what's left of the forest. Even the earth has been scorched savagely by fire.
These are you can see how deep the burning has been into this. These are peat. This is all peat soil.
Instead of an evergreen forest of black spruce, there's just charred trunks after the 2023 wildfires. But the damage to the soil here is even more important.
Most forests, most of the carbon is stored in the trees, but in this system, it's stored in the soil, and we have 80 to 90% of the carbon in the system stored below ground in these beautiful peat soils that are, when they're wet, they're resistant to fire, but when they're dry, they can be very, very flammable.
Fires are actually a natural part of the ecosystem here in this forest, bordering the Arctic Circle. But with conditions now drier and hotter, the fires are becoming bigger and more frequent.
You know, we had temperatures approaching 40 degrees here in the, we're in the subarctic and Arctic regions. So things that would not normally be fuel become fuel for the fires, and it means that the fire can access much more of the landscape and burn much larger areas, and there's nothing really to slow it down.
In 2023, Canada saw its worst wildfires since record-keeping began. The Inferno is thought to have released 3 times as much CO2 as the country's entire economy combined.
This is a big concern of these mega fire years, is that we'll see these boreal forests in Canada and elsewhere around the world moving from being really important sinks that buffer some of our own emissions to being sources of carbon to the atmosphere with global implications.
For several years now, more CO2 has been released from Canada's forests than the intact forest areas are able to absorb from the atmosphere. Balzer and her team have been researching the ecosystems in the Northwest Territories for over a decade.
The permafrost is at about 90 centimeters.
And I measured like 84.
10 centimeters of thaw?
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
I got 96.
They measure at what depth the permafrost begins. The forests north of the Arctic Circle, with their typical soils bearing lichens, mosses, and peat, store around 1/3 of all the carbon worldwide. That's more than twice as much the amount found in atmospheric CO2. So it's vital that the carbon stays in the ground.
Some of the most carbon-rich soils in the world happen in boreal systems where we have this accumulation of mosses that just because of the cold, wet conditions, they store a tremendous amount of carbon. These are also places where we have soils that are frozen year-round, and so if carbon gets locked away in permafrost, it's even more protected from being released to the atmosphere.
The scientists are investigating how the ecosystems of the far north are changing.
Diameter at breast height, 7.3.
Black spruce trees actually need fire to reproduce.
And it has cones.
It's the heat of the fire that releases the seeds in the cones. But with more frequent and more extreme fires, the cones now often char completely, so that the spruces can't reproduce. Back to the forest that burned in the fires, young aspen trees are growing back in some places. Balzer knows from previous experience that the forest recovers to varying degrees.
Sometimes it returns to what it was before the fire, so we call that resilience. Sometimes it transitions to a different tree species, so the forest is still there, but it functions in a different way. But where we see burning that's really severe or really frequent, these are places where we often see failure to return to forest.
With fires smoldering long afterwards, the fear is they could reignite when temperatures rise again. These forests are in an incredibly large, nearly untouched wilderness. Balzer says trying to fight the fires is impossible.
You can't access most of the forest up here in the north. For the most part up here, the only solution to this, to slow this fire cycle, is to really rapidly draw down our greenhouse gas emissions and, start to slow climate warming.
In 2023, northern Canada was 3 degrees Celsius warmer than in pre-industrial times. This trend could trigger a dangerous spiral, disrupting carbon sinks around the Arctic Circle that have taken thousands of years to form.
There is already too much carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So what can we do? Plants and trees are masters of absorbing CO2. With the help of light, they fix the carbon and release the oxygen. So could plant photosynthesis be imitated in the lab and perhaps even accelerated?
Professor Tobias Erb has an ambitious goal. He wants to improve nature, or at least one of nature's most important processes, photosynthesis, the process on which life on Earth is based. We humans can of course claim that photosynthesis doesn't work especially well, but plants actually live with it quite happily. But we humans always want more efficiency, so that we can achieve more with less. And that was the incentive for us to say, what more can we tease out of this system, even though it's had 3 billion years to evolve? Why hasn't it got better? Can I rethink it? During photosynthesis, light, water and carbon dioxide work together to produce a simple carbon compound, glucose, plus oxygen. The glucose stays in the plant, enabling it to grow, while the oxygen is released into the air. What Tobias Erb is interested in is the process of CO2 fixation in this cycle. Basically, the question is, how can I capture CO2 and convert it into useful compounds? How can I convert inanimate carbon into something organic? And being able to copy this fundamental principle, to rethink it, is actually what interests us in this whole matter. So what if we could find solutions that nature has never tried? What if more oxygen and more carbon compounds could be produced using a photosynthesis that's been optimized by humans? To do this, Tobias Erb first had to take a closer look at how plant photosynthesis works. It relies on rubisco, an enzyme that's responsible for converting the carbon dioxide. Rubisco converts at a rate of about 5 molecules of CO2 per second. But what if the plant could absorb 100 CO2 molecules per second? So they began searching for an enzyme that was better, faster, and more effective by trawling through research databases. And they found it in a bacterium. It's an enzyme that's involved in the citric acid cycle. It's called ECR. Experiments have shown that ECR is indeed much better than rubisco, both at converting CO2 and building carbon compounds. It kills two birds with one stone. We're reducing CO2, but we're also generating a useful product that's more complex than what nature does. They've now developed a prototype. It's rather like enzymes swimming around in a liquid. The task now is to incorporate this new operating system into a living organism. If algae could be equipped with the improved ability to bind CO2, algae farms could extract carbon dioxide from the air and use it to produce large quantities of oxygen and valuable carbon compounds. This could also revolutionize the chemical industry, because I wouldn't need crude oil to synthesize chemicals. I could produce everything from CO2 using light, all the petrochemical products I want. That's the big vision. And so far, initial results in the laboratory look very promising.
If our blood is red, why are they...
Do you have a science question? Send it to us as a video, text, or voice message. If we answer it on the show, we'll send you a little surprise as a thank you. So come on, just ask. This week's question comes from a viewer in Mexico.
How important are bees for humans? Bees are considered the third most important livestock animal in agriculture, after pigs and cows. There are thought to be up to 30,000 species worldwide. We've been breeding honeybees for thousands of years. Species that aren't domesticated are known as wild bees. They include certain kinds of bumblebees, for example. Bees pollinate many crops and therefore play a key role in our food supply. In Europe, 3/4 of all cultivated plants depend on bees for pollination. Without them, fruit trees would only produce 1/4 of their normal yield. Incidentally, studies have shown time and again that the best pollinators are not honeybees, but wild bees. One study looked over 40 different crop systems all over the world, from small-scale fields to giant monocultures, comparing pollination by honeybees with that of wild insects. The results showed that the same number of flower visits by wild bees led to harvests twice as high as when the flowers were visited by domesticated bees. Despite that, honeybees continue to draw most of our attention. Once back in the hive, the nectar and pollen they collect is enriched with enzymes and packed into honeycombs. The sweet result is turned into products that are thought to be good for your health, such as honey. It's said to help with colds, poor sleep, and blemished skin. But wild bees are also in focus. Researchers have studied the venom they produce. It contains an anti-inflammatory compound that might be useful against cancer. Honeybee venom also contains this compound, but its effects are stronger, so it also damages healthy cells. In a wild bee species, a variant was found that only works on cancer cells. That study also showed that bee venom has grown more toxic in the course of evolution.
And now it's time to look at peat bogs. Peatlands provide valuable habitats for rare plants and animals and can also store enormous amounts of CO2. But that's not the only thing that makes them so fascinating to scientists.
A well-known salt meadow landscape on the Baltic Sea. It was in a bog similar to this one that insect expert Tobias Minder made a sensational discovery not long ago. I was travelling with a friend in Brandenburg, where I come from. We often hunt for beetles there. The weather was good and I saw some remains sparkling in the sun. It turned out to be a beetle, so I took it with me. It's hard to clearly identify most beetle species in the field. There are over 6,000 of them in Germany. We knew it was old, but we didn't know just how old. Due to the low oxygen content and the amino acids in the soil, decomposition happens very slowly in bogland environments. It takes thousands of years for a peat bog to form. Less than a millimetre of new soil is deposited each year, so 10 metres of it represent 10,000 years of history. This means soil samples can help to determine the age of the beetle. Professor of Peatland Studies Hans Jorsten does one test on site. There's no sand in here at all, only organic material. The best way to check if there's sand in it is with your teeth. You can sense it immediately when you eat something. If there's sand in it, it crunches. Pure peat doesn't crunch. You can see this is a very diverse peat, made of purely organic material, root material from this vegetation. The samples are then taken to the laboratory for a more precise analysis. Further south in Bavaria, a local fen around the town of Leipheim also plays a key role. Intact peatlands are excellent CO2 reservoirs. Worldwide, they cover less than 3% of the land, but they store twice as much carbon as all forests put together. The Leipheimer Moors is also a breeding ground for protected birds, so that's all the more reason to preserve it. Our aim here is to both protect the climate and provide a great habitat for wildlife, and offer a recreational site for people too. Like many other peatland areas, however, the Leipheimer Moors was drained long ago to provide farmland. Many types of grain only grow in dry fields, so ditches were dug to remove the water. In the Leipheimer Moors, conservationists now want to turn back the clock to re-wet the bog. They applied for permission 30 years ago. For the last 12 years, they've been allowed to discharge water into it again. We have a government mandate for re-wetting because we now know that dry peatland bogs harm the climate. By raising the water levels, we immediately stop their emissions. That's the great thing about peatland re-wetting. They're taking water from the river Nau, a tributary of the Danube. Ideally, the bog should be kept flooded the whole time, but that's not possible yet. Strict regulations govern how much water can be siphoned from waterways. In summer, it's very hot and windy, and the vegetation grows fast, so a lot of water evaporates. That means you have to keep topping it up. The working group is hoping to get permission to pump in even more water. But the changes are already having an impact for locals, like farmer Christian Meyer. The re-wetting is forcing him to adapt. There used to be fields here where we planted potatoes and corn, but with the re-wetting, that's no longer possible. So he brought in water buffalo. Other grazing animals wouldn't eat much of the peatland plants, and they would founder in the boggy ground. More farmers are realising they need to change. It's reaching a point where they can no longer farm these areas any other way, so they're looking for alternatives. Meyer currently keeps 20 buffalo on his 20 hectares. But for things to work, more farmers need to get on board. The problem is, government funding for these changes is limited. Meanwhile, back at the University of Greifswald in North Germany, Tobias Minder and Hans Jorsten are studying their bog beetle. We removed the remains from the lump of peat and then identified them under a microscope using specialist literature. Thanks to the intact wing cases, they can identify it as a cane beetle. But Hans Jorsten still wants to know how old it is, using plant pollen. Every year, around 10,000 pollen grains fall on every square centimetre of soil. These pollen grains vary depending on which tree produced them. A beech tree has completely different pollen grains than a birch, for example. And different pollen prevails in every age because the vegetation has changed over the millennia. After the Ice Age, the only trees were actually birch and pine. It took thousands of years before the alder or the elm or the oak came in. And that's how we found out that this beetle must have died and ended up in the bog around 6,000 to 6,500 years ago. An ancient beetle preserved almost perfectly by the acidic environment of the peat bog. Intact bogs grow very slowly. That makes them a treasure trove. They're layers of soil revealing how the climate has changed over the last 10,000 years.
And that's all for this week on Tomorrow Today, DW's Science Show. Thanks for joining us and see you again next time. Bye for now.